sorry, the number you have reached is not in service. Please check the number or try your call again. This is a recording.
Are you listening?
Listen to people. Learn what you can.
What is racist and what is just ignorance?
If you've got a friend or an ally or somebody in your corner there to support you, amazing.
I just can't wait for the day where we're no longer pleasantly surprised that someone is LGBT+.
Ask questions on a personal level, do better.
Asking pronouns.
It was like the moment that I realised I was different.
Winning that award topped this year off for me.
Because without you, this world wouldn't be the same.
Are you listening?
Are you listening?
Are you listening?
Are you listening?
Welcome back to Are You Listening, the Oxfordshire Youth Podcast. Are You Listening is a podcast for young people, by young people, to discuss all of the things that they're passionate about. At Oxfordshire Youth, we wanted to make sure that young people had a space to fully express themselves in a way that they felt completely confident about. And that's how this podcast was created. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hey everyone, my name's Nabila. My pronouns are she, her. Welcome back to Are You Listening podcast. This is the last episode of the Activism segment. Thank you so much for listening. So before we go into today's episode, there is a trigger warning on abortion. If this episode is triggering to any listeners, please listen to our other episodes where we cover many other topics. Before we go into today's episode, I will cover a few terms that will be mentioned throughout. The definition of abortion. The deliberate termination of a human pregnancy, most often performed during the first 28 weeks of pregnancy. The definition of medical racism. Racism in medicine reflects the working lives of doctors from ethnic minority backgrounds and the healthcare experiences of ethnic minority patients. The definition of Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade, 1973. The right to abortion was interpreted by the judges as deriving from the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, which prohibits the state from depriving persons of life, liberty, or property without fair procedure. The definition of pre-eclampsia. A condition in pregnancy characterized by high blood pressure, sometimes with fluid retention, and proteinuria. The definition of lupus. Lupus is an autoimmune disease. This means the body's natural defense system, immune system, attacks healthy parts of your body. The definition of Mrs. Bibi Begum syndrome. Derived after the common South Asian surnames Bibi and Begum, it refers to an imagined condition where South Asian women are said to exaggerate their health complaints despite showing few objective signs of ill health. The definition of colonization. The action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. The definition of gaslighting. To gaslight someone means to manipulate another person into doubting their own perceptions, experiences, or understanding of events. Thank you so much for listening to the last episode of the Activism segment. I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
There's a point that you made. I think so you were talking about with the government and the other organisation that you work with on making it part of the curriculum and such. There's definitely a common denominator that I'm seeing about campaigning and really coming together, as Faustine was talking about as well, on making that part of the curriculum. So we can see there that campaigning and protesting, these are all such important ways of as young people, they're really important to us because, to be honest, it feels like nothing else can be done. Unless there is a campaign, it won't be spoken about. So I wanted to move on to another space of activism, which I personally am involved in quite a lot with Help the World Oxford, is public demonstrations and protesting. And I know that Oxfordshire Youth Strike and XR and such, we have that in common. We go out onto the streets, So Maryam, would you like to tell us a bit about Help the World Oxford and our experiences with protesting and public demonstrations, and why you think it's an important space of activism to you and to the public.
Protesting I feel like has been used throughout history as a way for the people to have a voice, to have power, and even that I feel like has been politicized recently with, well, I don't know how long ago it was now, with was it Priti Patel trying to restrict protesting rights and basically just trying to stop people from protesting. But as someone who's been involved in a lot of protests, it's really, honestly, the euphoria you get, I think, is incredible when you're out there with other people, having your voice heard, seeing and recognizing that people understand that you've done something good, that you've maybe, even if you've just changed one person's opinion, or you've raised awareness and you've brought the issue to one person, that even is, I think, an amazing thing. I think it's also how and what you do at a protest that matters. With, like, what are you saying? What message are you trying to convey to people? I think that's really important, because sometimes I feel in protests things can get lost in translation, or lost in meaning. Like, people can see you pretend and be like, well, I don't know what that was for, I don't understand why they're protesting. So I think having a clear message is really important, and a clear goal. I also find art, I think we were talking about this earlier, different spaces of activism. Art to me is really powerful because it's often with what we see first, or what people see first. They'll look at something immediately, something eye-catching, that's something that will make a difference, something they'll be like, what, hold on, what does this say? What does this mean? And that, I think, can sometimes be even more powerful than words, because it's just so, especially if it's something really, where did I go? I went to Tate Modern a couple of months ago, I want to say. I think it was a month ago. And I just saw a really powerful picture. And it just stuck in my mind. Like, when you just have a mental picture of something in your mind. I just had a mental picture of it for weeks and weeks. And I just realised how impactful art is through activism, because how these mental images often stay in people's minds. They often have a much more lasting effect. Sometimes words have the same. I'm not saying they don't, but I think personally that art is very, very powerful in conveying and shaping meanings around activism.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I've been involved in a lot of sort of art-based activism, especially for disability. But absolutely, the way that an image will stay with you, and words stay with you as well, definitely. But there's something about the way that an image will stay with you.
Yeah, there's something, I don't know what it is, but it's something so powerful in an image in art. And I think I just love creating art that has a meaning, that represents something or tries to convey something. I find it helps me to channel any anger or frustration I'm feeling about, okay, well, what can I do to help? What can I do to change? Well, I can create something, I can share it, I can spread awareness through what I paint, through what I draw. So I guess in that way, it's also a great way to channel your activism.
Yeah, it's therapeutic.
Yeah, definitely.
Molly, did you want to start the conversation on intersectional identities within activism? I think that would be really interesting to talk about within us.
Yeah, absolutely. It can sort of add another layer to activism when you have sort of different identities within one space. So for example, a white woman would experience feminism in a much different way than women of color, or LGBT women, or disabled women. And it's sort of the working towards intersectionality and how that sort of exists within yourself and sort of making a home for yourself within activist spaces. Nor, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this.
And I think the environmental space, or certainly the one I'm in, is very exclusive. It tends into environmentalism. There's a big problem with it kind of being middle class white people, and of course that's only in this country. Around the world, there are some incredible activists, like the ones in Latin America, who like risk their lives. They're incredible. So in terms of like within the environmental movement, it's about kind of looking where the environmentalists kind of are, who are kind of experiencing different things and incorporating that sort of in what we're doing in Oxford. So we've spoken, so like within Fridays for Future, there are so many groups around the world. So we often, it tends to not be within our own group, but it tends to be in terms of interacting with other groups that intersectionality comes in. And so much of what we do is based on decisions made in other countries. So things like our strike themes and our hashtags and our graphic design are all done by activists deliberately, not in sort of kind of mainly white countries or groups that have kind of really imbalanced gender representation, to make sure that even the groups who aren't representative of maybe their communities are presenting a message that's representative of like the global community.
That's really cool. I guess it's sort of trying to find a way to make sustainability accessible to everyone. And I've seen such sort of great strides, especially in the past few years, of making it more affordable for everyday people and more accessible to the working class and to disabled people. And that's super important, sort of considering how your activism impacts on other groups. And yeah, I've seen some great progress in that, especially within the environmental movement.
Another topic that I wanted to talk about was Roe v. Wade and how what's happening in America could particularly affect intersectional people with uteruses. And for example, we were talking about people who, for example, may not be able to afford the right care in an abortion as such. If we could talk about the identities of people which are being affected by the laws such as Roe v. Wade.
It's often with these policies, it's often women of colour and people of colour and people of lower class backgrounds who are affected the most because they don't have the resources and they don't have the privileges that white middle class people do. Like say, like you were talking about Roe v. Wade, say if a middle class person wanted to get an abortion easily, could fly to a country where it's legal, get it done, dusted, no problem. Whereas someone, say from a lower class, poorer background, who may not have that privilege would suffer more. And it's kind of, it does give, a dystopian view of the world currently, and it kind of does feel like we've just travelled 100 years back in time. If you look at it in the past, women had to suffer a lot to get abortions in the past. They had to go through to incredible lengths, lots of pain, and it was often the lower working class people who suffered the most and who'd often die from these traumatic surgeries and operations they had to have these abortions. So it does kind of feel like we've just travelled back in time to the past and made it even more difficult for people to access a basic right and choice, regardless of what your beliefs are.
What Maryam was saying is like really spot on, and I feel the same. I think all these policies, like in general for everyone, you can't, in my view, you can't stop an abortion happening. Like the only avenue you're forcing people to have is to do it unsafely. But I think with this policy, it's going to hit particularly Black women the most, because it's already quite dangerous for Black women to give birth. I think the statistic is probably 3 to 4 times more likely to die whilst giving birth. So it's already a very dangerous thing for us to have to do. And now you're kind of adding this factor on top of it. It's just making things very, very dangerous. And I really do worry for our community, and I think that's why intersectionality is a really important lens to see all issues through. Like, this issue has a racial element, and we can't pretend it's not there and that it doesn't happen, because it is very real. So I think that's what I'd add.
Thank you. No, that's perfect. Actually, Faustine, if you feel comfortable, could you maybe educate? I know for myself, I would like to know more on how women of color, particularly Black women, in the medical field, how the discrimination against Black women in hospitals, in hospital environments as such. If you wanted to talk a little bit more about that, because I would like to know more, but only if you feel comfortable, of course.
Yeah, sure. You're definitely putting my knowledge to the test here, Nabila. So I'm not going to say specific dates just because I can't remember everything off the top of my head, but I'll just try and explain a little bit from my side. So during periods of slavery, there were different doctors who would practice things on enslaved people, obviously with no anesthesia, nothing was used for pain relief. And a really common trope that came out of this was that black people, but particularly Black women, have thicker skin, so feel no pain, which is obviously a very racist and untrue trope. And this has unfortunately led, even in the 21st century, to women being denied pain relief whilst in hospital. And there's still avenues that people aren't sure about. So there's something called Pre-Eclampsia, which Black women and also South Asian women are more likely to get whilst giving birth. And no one's really figured out why that is, but it's just something that has been kind of an issue for several decades. So those are two things I'd say are the important things to consider when talking about childbirth and Black women. Kind of makes sense that these racist tropes basically started and have just never really stopped since then.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I feel like medical bias against Black and brown women is so overlooked. I stumbled across something the other week. It's called I think it's called Mrs. Begum Bibi syndrome, and it's to do with South Asian women and how often they are gaslighted or they're ignored by medical professionals because they have this trope that they complain a lot or they make up things. So sometimes most of the time they'll have real conditions that are just overlooked by medical professionals, and they're seen as just making it up or just lying because that's just them, they're just dramatic. And alongside that, there's such a lack of research into Black and brown people and the conditions we have and the problems we face because of colonization. For instance, I read another article about how South Asian people find it harder to build muscle because our bodies have been programmed to famine and starvation because of the amount of famines our ancestors face. So we've been programmed to store food and store fat, which is crazy if you think about it, that colonization is still affecting our bodies to this day. And just in regards to, like I said, the conditions that affect Black and brown people they're just overlooked. There's not enough medical research done into the conditions and the problems we face, like Faustine was talking about pre-eclampsia. No one knows why it happens. No one really cares because, well, it's not affecting white people, so why should we care? And I think that medical bias is such a problem, and it's so overlooked. We don't really talk about it because I feel like the medical field is somewhere we just tend to stay away from, and we don't realise the amount of issues and the racial biases and prejudices that are present in the medical world.
Yeah, I've noticed, I study a lot of science and medicine, and I've noticed, and I know that other people have as well, this sort of horrible trend of a lot of medical textbooks only show conditions on white skin. So there's such a lack of sort of education that even a doctor with the best will in the world has no idea what this particular sort of rash looks like on darker skin. They struggle to identify bruises because they've never seen them on a darker skin tone. So even with the, like I said, with the best will in the world, no doctor has been educated on this sort of thing, and that's terrifying.
It is scary. I've experienced it firsthand when I have lupus, and when it was a struggle getting diagnosed because I would constantly just be gaslighted and ignored, like, oh, she's just being dramatic, oh, she's just being a teenager, you know, she's just being lazy, there's nothing really wrong with her. And lupus is a condition that prominently affects I think black and brown women, and you just experience this racial bias. Like I've experienced the Mrs. Bibi Begum syndrome firsthand, and it is scary. It is scary.
Thank you, Faustine and Maryam, for sharing that. I definitely learned a lot that I think a lot of us have as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. It's been amazing chatting to all of you. We've learnt a lot, and I'm very pleased to have gotten the chance to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for being here and for listening.
Oh, thank you, Maryam, Faustine, and Noor, for being here. We appreciate it lots.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Are You Listening? This brings the end of the activism segment. So in this episode, we covered really important topics such as medical racism and terms such as colonization. Please do listen out to our next episodes of Are You Listening? And I encourage you to listen back to the other episodes of the activism segment. This episode meant a lot to me, and thank you so much for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode of Are You Listening, make sure you subscribe, whether you're on Anchor, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And also make sure you're following us on social media as well, at Oxfordshire Youth on Instagram and TikTok, and at OxYouth on Twitter.